So his name had to be Greg, didn't it? That's great. That's great. Well, I am really, really glad that you're here today. If you're new to Suncrest this weekend, like Jamie said, we usually teach in a series, and I'm at the end of a 4-week series where we've been talking about me and my big mouth, and I am going to start a new series next week that's all about what it means to actually follow Jesus. And I'm going to do my best to explain it in everyday language so everyone can kind of get their mind around what a spiritual experience looks like Monday through Friday. So hopefully you'll be back next week, and I'll tackle that for the following 4 weeks. But let's finish up this series today. It's been an enjoyable series and a harsh self-look at ourselves, I think. So let's just kind of start where we started many of the previous weeks. The title is Me and My Big Mouth. Will you say that with me? Me and my big mouth, right? But we've been emphasizing this isn't about your son and his big mouth, or your wife and her big mouth, or your mother-in-law or your brother-in-law. This is about me and my big mouth, you and your big mouth. So let's say it all together again with a special emphasis on the words me and my. Let's do it. Me and my big mouth. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, I talked from the letter called James in the New Testament. This is fascinating. One of Jesus' brothers wrote one of the letters that we have in our New Testament. He devoted parts of 2 different chapters to this very subject, and we just zeroed in really on 6 words: quick to listen and slow to speak. Quick to listen and slow to speak. Would you say that with me? Quick to listen and slow to speak. And some of you are doing the hand motions. Let's do the hand motions if you were here the last few weeks. Quick to listen and slow to speak. And this is so important for every relationship that we have. If we could be quick to listen, outrageously curious, someone who wants to learn, not just react or respond, then we start to understand what someone else is saying. And if we could be slow to speak, literally late to speak, to let the moment pass where we have our perfect comeback and instead give it some consideration and decide what we want to say and how we want to say it later on, so we could be quick to listen and slow to speak. It's so powerful because our words are powerful. And the truth is that our tongue, at least according to James, is actually untamable. You will not solve this problem, so it is about managing this your whole life through. And then last week, Jamie shifted to a passage by the Apostle Paul, which I thought was so good and so fascinating. The idea was this: that every conversation you're in, every conversation, it could be face-to-face, it could be on the phone, it could be by email or text, but every conversation you're in, you should think of it like a construction site. And since it's a construction site, the goal for every follower of Jesus is that when words come out of our mouth or through our fingers, those words serve to build someone up. And if you just think about the conversations you've had over the last 24 hours or over the last week and think, okay, out of all those conversations, did every one of them build the other person up rather than tear them down? And it doesn't mean you can't say hard things. Sometimes you have to say hard things to build someone up. But your spirit is to build them up. That's powerful. And of course, Jamie reminded us last week that one of the reasons that a lot of us struggle with this is because something has happened to us and it's caused bitterness to take root inside of us. And this is really the powerful concept that I want to close with today. That for all of us who have been wronged, which is probably all of us to some degree or another, some of you have been intensely wronged. For all of us who have been wronged, we have to know that the words that come out of our mouths could just be us bleeding on people who weren't even the ones who wronged us. Because something's gone on inside of us. We haven't gotten rid of the bitterness that's there. We haven't reconciled it with God. We haven't forgiven someone. We feel like someone still owes us, and then we just kind of overflow onto all the people around us, many times the most meaningful people in our lives who were not the ones to wrong us. So we have to reconcile a view of who we are and who God is in that bitterness. And this is possible. It's possible that one day, the very person who hurt you, the very person who wronged you, will actually come back into your life. They will show up at your door. They will show up on your phone. They will walk into your life, and the decisions that you have to make about how you're going to handle that when you're face to face with the person who wronged you, this will shape not only you, but I think the potential impact is immeasurable with how you handle that conversation when it comes. And it has everything to do with whether or not you were able to get rid of your bitterness. So let me just start with this statement today. There is a brand of hurt from the past that brands us. And by brands us, I mean it makes its mark on us. Its mark is going to live there probably for the rest of your lives. You are not going to forget what happened to you. The only thing you can hope for is that whatever happened to you does not cause bitterness to take root. Because we know this about people. It's hurt people who actually tend to hurt other people. And ironically, it's those who have been bullied that often become the bully themselves. And it's neglected sons who become distant fathers and detached husbands. And it's abandoned daughters who become suspicious wives. Because the things that shaped us start to overflow out of us into all of the relationships around us. And this is so powerful. And what you do with reconciling the things that have hurt you, the wrongs that have been done to you, the injustice that you have faced, the opportunities that were taken away, what you do with those internally and with God will shape what comes out of your mouth in almost all of our situations. And so today I'm going to tell you what I think is the second greatest story ever told. I think the story of Jesus is the greatest story I've ever told, but this one from the Old Testament, in some ways it's a precursor, even a foreshadowing to the story of Christ himself, but it is an absolutely fascinating story. My dilemma today is that I'm going to tell you this story very quickly, so we're going to pick up a guy's life when he's 17 years old, and we're going to make it all the way until he's 40, and actually the length of time that he endured has a lot to do with how much bitterness one might feel, and it's going to feel like it goes fast even though it was slow in real life. So I'm going to try to set up this story in the most obvious way I can with a little background. Many of you know that those of us who are followers of Jesus, we live under what's called a new covenant. It's a covenant that Jesus made when he went to the cross. And all of us who are followers of Jesus, that's our covenant. There was a previous covenant to that called the Old Covenant. It's recorded in the Old Testament, and that is a covenant that God had with a particular group of people for a particular period of time for a particular purpose to bring Christ into the world. And actually, there's a little bit of time before that Old Covenant that is Genesis chapter 1 through 11, where God was trying to relate to the whole world. Now, this is fascinating because if you follow history and you want to maybe even read the Bible, a lot of us start in Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible. You can read the first 11 chapters of Genesis. That's God's interaction with the whole world. Until in Genesis chapter 12, he comes into a relationship with a man named Abraham. And it's with Abraham that God makes this covenant, this old covenant. It's not our covenant anymore, but there's so much to learn from how God relates to his people. And then this is how this story is going to unfold. So Abraham was promised to have kids and grandkids, eventually to make a great nation. He and Sarah waited a long time, and they eventually had a son named Isaac. Now, Isaac was not actually Abraham's first son. Abraham's first son was named Ishmael, but that was when Abraham took things into his own hands, dishonored God, and that was not the son God had in mind for him. So we have Isaac, Abraham, then Isaac, and Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the one who kind of provides the lineage. Jacob, this will get confusing, is sometimes also named Israel. So when Jacob has 12 sons, these are actually the ones who become known, all their families, as the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is kind of wild. Out of Jacob's 12 sons, number 11 is named Joseph. And Joseph's story, I think, is the second greatest story ever told. But you have to understand what's going on here. Joseph's brothers did not like him. And one of the reasons they did not like him is because Joseph was his dad's favorite son. The reason Joseph was his dad's favorite son is because Joseph was the son of Jacob's favorite wife. And you can kind of see how family dysfunction is going to just kind of go from there, right? Little life lesson. This is free today. Guys, it's always a bad idea to have a favorite wife. Life does not go well when that's the case. So he has this favorite wife. He becomes his dad's favorite son. And Joseph has what you might have heard of as the coat of many colors, or if you have a different source, the Technicolor dream coat. And Joseph is hated by his brothers. One day his brothers get him out away from his dad, and they decide that they're going to kill him. They're just going to kill him. Of course, they're not going to tell their dad that they killed him. They're going to make up a story. And they actually, this is kind of wild, they throw him into a pit that he cannot get out of. And then they decide, let's have lunch. And while they're having lunch, considering how they're going to kill him, this is what happens. It says, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. Now, I won't go into all the history, but you heard me say a moment ago that Abraham's son that did not honor God was Ishmael. That's a whole other line, but it's a fascinating way that the story weaves itself together. These Ishmaelites are coming through, and they are slave traders. And so this is how the conversation goes. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. I love this. After all, he is our brother. I mean, just this compassion that oozes out of these boys for a moment to realize, no, let's not kill him, let's sell him, because then we get some cash too. Our own flesh and blood, and his brothers agreed. And so they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites were just slave traders, so they were going to take him to some faraway country and sell him, and Joseph would never be heard of again in their minds. What happens is they take him all the way to Egypt. They put him up for sale, and when he's in Egypt, he gets bought. Here's how the story continues. It says, Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought Joseph. Now, this is kind of wild, because in some ways, this is horrifying. He's 17 years old. He's taken away from his home, from his dad, out of his country, to a place he doesn't know the language, he doesn't know the people. He gets sold into a pretty good gig, into a house that's someone who's serving Pharaoh, and he kind of quickly rises up to the top of that gig. And so the scripture actually says, the Lord was with Joseph. And I think for a moment, well, isn't that taking it a little too far? I mean, yeah, he was sold into a good house, but he was sold. He's a slave. He's a teenager who doesn't know what to do. He's been taken away from his family and his homeland. So this very idea, this is an important idea, that God is with you, even in the injustice, is a critical way for understanding this story. Joseph's faithful to Potiphar, takes care of all of his affairs. And then one day, Potiphar's wife comes to Joseph and seduces him. In fact, probably commands him, since he's a slave, to say, you must sleep with me. And Joseph didn't want to do it. Joseph wanted to honor both Potiphar as his master and God. In fact, in the conversation, Potiphar's wife had probably never been told no before, but Joseph says no, and he says, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And this is so important to think about, because I don't know about you, but I have had times in my life where I felt like God was treating me unfairly, where I was trying to do the right thing, but I was getting the wrong result. And in those moments, it's very tempting to say, well, God, if you're not with me, then I'm going to do what I want to do. Very tempting. But Joseph did not do that. The story gets worse. Joseph resists again and again and again. So Potiphar's wife one day steals his robe and makes the claim that Joseph raped her. It's a false accusation. But when she made the accusation, everything had to happen. So Potiphar fires Joseph, ends up putting him in prison, even though it wasn't true. And Joseph ends up in prison. Here's where the story picks up. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. You'll see this theme as you go all throughout Joseph's life. Wronged again. And for a lot of us, this doesn't make sense. In our minds, we think, aren't good things supposed to happen to good people and bad things supposed to happen to bad people? But that's not how it works in this world. In this world, Joseph's brothers who sold him into slavery are doing just fine, and Joseph's not. In this world, Potiphar's wife, who made the false accusation, is doing fine, and Joseph's not. And yet somehow Joseph's able to have a perspective with God that even in the midst of the injustice, God is at work with him. And this is kind of one of the funniest lines in, I think, the whole story. How do we know the Lord was with him? Because he granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Now, just think about that for a minute. Is this the favor of God that you want? That you'd be granted favor in the eyes of the prison warden? And yet he was. Now, while he's in prison, this is a fascinating story. He comes across two guys who had worked for Pharaoh. One was a baker, made things for Pharaoh. One was the cupbearer for Pharaoh. And if you know what a cupbearer is in ancient times, here's the idea. The cupbearer is kind of the personal servant, maybe the butler to Pharaoh. One of his jobs was to bring Pharaoh his wine, but before Pharaoh would drink the wine, the cupbearer took a drink of the wine just in case it had been poisoned, so that Pharaoh would know, if he drops dead, I shouldn't drink it. But these two guys had gotten on Pharaoh's wrong side. They ended up in prison also. Fascinating, they both had dreams. And they couldn't figure out the interpretation to their dreams. And one day when they're with Joseph, Joseph says, hey, I've had some luck at interpreting dreams. Let me take a shot at it. So they tell him the dreams. And this is kind of wild. The cupbearer tells him the dream, and Joseph's like, oh, this is good news for you. Here's what that dream means. In just a few days, Pharaoh's going to call you back into his presence. You're going to be lifted up and restored into your position, and it's going to be fantastic. Things will go well for you. And the baker's like, hey, don't forget about my dream. Here's my dream. What's going to happen to me? And Joseph says, well, you're going to be lifted up too, kind of in a different way. Your head's going to be lifted off your body. Your body's going to be lifted up and impaled on a big stake, and then the birds are going to come and eat your body. And I always think, like, if I was in Joseph's shoes and it's like, what's my dream mean? I'd be like, I don't know. I can't figure that one out. But what happened is that these things started to come about just as Joseph had predicted. Now, before the cupbearer went back and had this experience, Joseph very intently said to the cupbearer, now, when you're back with Pharaoh and you're back in this position, remember me. Remember me. Tell him about this guy who was falsely accused and stuck in prison and be willing to serve. Like, remember me. Don't forget me. And so this happened exactly as it was predicted. The cupbearer went back into Pharaoh's presence. Pharaoh lifted him up. And Joseph had to be thinking, this is my day. And it never came. This is my week. And it never came. This is my year. Joseph stayed in prison for years. The story goes on that Pharaoh then had a dream. And they were trying to interpret this dream, and nobody could figure it out. And then it's almost like one day the cupbearer, who is giving the wine to the Pharaoh, thinks, oh yeah, there was this guy in prison. He told me my dream. I was supposed to remember him. But Pharaoh needs his dream interpreted. I'll tell Pharaoh there's a guy who can interpret the dreams. This is, leading up to that time, this is what happened. It says the cupbearer did not remember Joseph. Now, he eventually got to the place where he remembered him. But some of you have felt this feeling. It felt like everyone else in life moved on, but nobody remembers what happened to you. You remember what happened to you. I mean, it's shaping you. There's potentially even seeds of bitterness that are overflowing in your life, but just feels forgotten. Well, eventually Joseph gets called up into Pharaoh's presence, and Pharaoh asks Joseph if he can and will interpret the dream. And I think the next thing that comes out of Joseph's mouth is absolutely fascinating. He says this. He says, I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will. Now, there's a lot of layers in this simple sentence. I want you to think about it with me just for a moment. First of all, Pharaoh thought of himself as God. He thought of himself as a deity. And so for Joseph to be willing to come face to face with Pharaoh and say, you're not God, but there is a God, my God, who can interpret this, that's powerful. There's another part of this. This is very important. That when you and I walk through our lives and our faith and processing what's happened to us, there's a way to think about it that says, I have a part in it. God has a part in it. And everyone I'm interacting with has their part in it. And the last thing that you want to do as you're walking through life is to mix up what your part is and God's part. For you to try to start doing God's part yourself, or for you to stop doing your part yourself. And in this case, Joseph gets it right. He says, I can't do it. I understand what my part is. But God can. And then something fascinating happens. Joseph interprets the dream perfectly. He predicts that there will be 7 years of great plenty in the country. The harvest is going to be amazing. Everything's going to go great. But he said, here's the problem. Because it's going to last for 7 years, people will start to get used to it, and they'll think this is the way it's always going to be. But this isn't the way it's always going to be. Because 7 years later, there's going to be 7 years of drought. And just a couple of years into that drought, people are going to be wondering, what's happened to us? And Joseph says to Pharaoh, he says, so here's what has to happen. You have to make sure that during these 7 years of plenty, you store some up for the 7 years of drought. And Joseph actually makes a bold suggestion to Pharaoh. He says, you're going to need an administrator, someone who will keep his eye on the ball, someone who won't let this slip away during the 7 years of plenty. You need to tax people 20% on all the grain that they bring in. You're going to store it up. You're going to have these cities all over, cities of grain, and that administrator has to keep his eye on the ball. And if you do that, then you'll be loved in the land. People from other countries will need to come and buy your grain, and Pharaoh, you're going to live in power. And right in response to this dream, Pharaoh says to Joseph, you're my administrator. I'm putting you in charge. You're essentially the prime minister of Egypt. Now, some people look at that and say, oh, that's kind of wild. Is that even realistic that Pharaoh would put him in charge? And I think if you stop and think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because Joseph had just been the one who had predicted this. And here's the thing. If his prediction was right, then he's exactly the guy for the job. And if his prediction was wrong, if it doesn't come into this, then Pharaoh's just going to get rid of him anyway. And so Joseph organizes all of this for Pharaoh, becomes the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And things play out exactly like Joseph interpreted the dream. For 7 years, they're storing up extra grain. It means that Egypt's in decent shape when the drought comes. And guess what? People from neighboring countries need to start coming to Pharaoh. So, in kind of a wild turn of events, Joseph's brothers and his dad are in a neighboring country. They're looking at each other. They had not prepared for this famine, and they hear that there's grain in Egypt and decide that they're going to make their way there. Then this is what happens. It says, now Joseph was the governor of the land. He was the governor of the land. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. They showed up at the actual location where Joseph was in Egypt. Although Joseph recognized that these were his brothers, they did not recognize him. And do you know why they did not recognize him? It's because he walked like an Egyptian. That is a generational joke that some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, right? But this is actually the scene. Think about this. Joseph knows what's going on. His brothers don't know what's going on. They're coming and bowing down before him, asking if they can buy some grain. And this is the moment. It's a fascinating scene where the people, the very people who had wronged Joseph, were now at his mercy. The words that were going to come out of Joseph's mouth next to the 10 people who had wronged him, his 10 older brothers. This was the moment. And I just want to ask you about when this moment comes in your life. Think about this. What do you do? What do you do when your words can shape the one who wronged you? What do you do when the one who wronged you walks back in the door, shows up on your phone? When you have the chance and maybe some power that could control their destiny and where they're going to go. You've been wronged. What do you do to them? This is the moment that Joseph is in. And I think clearly there's two options. Number one, you can extend the grudge. You absolutely can extend the grudge. In some ways, it makes perfect sense. They did something wrong to you, and now you have the chance to do something wrong back to them, to make them pay. They owe you. And if Joseph had allowed bitterness to reign through his life, through all the injustice that he faced, that is exactly what he would have chosen to do. It's option A. Option B. You could choose to extend them grace. To take the one who wronged you and say, I'm not going to pay you back. To decide that they don't owe you. To decide, in the words of Jesus, to bless those who cursed you. And that's the choice. When you've been wronged, when you've been hurt, when someone took something from you, what do you do? A few years goes by. And the truth is that in these few years, Joseph, you might even say, toys with his brothers a little bit. It's hard to know exactly what was going on inside of Joseph. Maybe he wanted to play with him a little bit. Someone who's thinking insidiously could think that. Maybe he wanted to try to take some time to kind of work through what he was going to do. But he actually sets up a couple of scenarios where they go back to their country, but they're forced to come back to him. And then eventually they come back to him again. Joseph has his brothers in the room. They still don't know who he is. And he asks all of the attendants that he has to leave the room. So it's just Joseph and his brothers. And here's what happens. He said to his brothers, I am Joseph. I'm your brother. I'm the one you threw in the pit. I'm the one that you hated and sold. That's me. And then the text says, and they wedded themselves. The text doesn't really say that. I just made that up. But they should have, right? It says something actually very similar. Follow this. This is what it actually says. He says, I am Joseph. Is Dad still alive? Is Dad still alive? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. In this very moment, he held all the power, and they had been the ones who did things wrong. And Joseph had a choice to make. He could either extend the grudge, or he could extend them grace. And this is why I think this is the second most powerful story in history, because it is in fact the precursor, maybe even the foreshadowing to what Jesus would do. Because in this circumstance for Joseph and in this circumstance for us, here's the deal. We either choose to treat someone just like they treated us, or we choose to treat someone the way we would want to be treated. And if you choose to treat someone just the way they treated you, it'll just continue the cycle. I mean, honestly, if he extends the grudge and puts them in prison and then later on they get on top and he's on bottom, don't you think they're just going to go back and do the exact same way? This is how the broken world works. Someone has to interrupt the broken world. Someone has to say, even though you wronged me, I'm not going to extend the grudge. I'm going to extend you grace. And the only way to do that in our lives is if we have reconciled and gotten rid of the bitterness that is inside of us. So instead, Joseph says, no, I want you to go back to your country. I want you to bring your kids. I want you to bring your grandkids. I want to meet every one of your kids. I want to learn their names. I want to learn their wives' names. I want us to be a family again. There's plenty here. I can take care of us. Bring Dad. I want to see Dad. And instead of paying them back, he paved the way for something powerful. I think in part because he was quick to listen and slow to speak. Now, there's kind of a fascinating turn here because they all come to the country, everything's kind of happy, but the brothers are still living on edge because in part they know Joseph's in this because he wants to see Dad. And then the texts tell us that Dad dies. And as soon as Dad dies, it says his brothers came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said to him. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Now that's a powerful question. Joseph was crystal clear on the idea that he was not God. And when you think about the framing of this question, you think many times when people use this phrase, am I in the place of God, they're talking about God as a God of justice. Am I the one to avenge what was wrong? Am I the one to deliver the punishment because of what you wrong? Is that me? And Joseph's saying that's not me. But in kind of an ironic sort of way, he's actually saying, yes, I'm trying to represent God to you. Because God does not extend the grudge with you. He extends his grace. To everyone in this room and everyone in Joseph's room, the message of God is that though we have wronged God, Christ would come into the world and he would not ask you to pay back what you have done wrong, but instead he would take the penalty for you and he would extend grace to you and set you free. And the potential for immeasurable impact, not just for you, but for generations after you, comes with how you decide to handle the moment when the person who's wronged you walks into your room. And I'm asking you, to be the kind of person who has seen the work of God, to see through the lens of the perspective of God, even when things are not going well for you. To stop reading your life just based on the circumstances of your life and letting that gauge how you view God. But instead to believe that God has come to reconcile us, and you have a role in that reconciliation. I know someone stole from you. One day you might encounter the person who stole your first marriage, or stole the innocence of your childhood, or stole the opportunities that were yours. And I'm asking you to get rid of all bitterness, to reconcile all that's going on with God, and let it be well with your soul. Because if bitterness reigns, the grudge just gets extended, the fights continue, the cycle becomes a downward spiral. But if you, even as someone who's been wronged, could be quick to listen and slow to speak, you could interrupt the cycle. And as it did for Joseph, and as it did for Jesus, it could be for us that it changes generations to come. I'd like to pray for that right now. God, thanks for your goodness to us. God, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, we understand and believe that your Son died for us and did not give us what we deserved. I pray we see the whole world through that lens and carry forward reconciliation. In Jesus' name.